from here, I think, we're looking at this from a sectoral lens now, and I think it's as we do so, I think it's important to also look at the other side of this, which is really related to climate change, and even the inclusion of references to climate change in the text of the Global Compact was a hard-fought battle, if I can say. And I think this is true for civil society, but also true for governments who particularly suffer from climate change. And then we have with us Kylie, and Kylie, you've worked quite a lot on the issue of climate change and climate-induced migration. And I was wondering if you can share with us some of the challenges that you are seeing in the next couple of months, or even on a longer term perspective, with regards to climate change and migration, and climate change induced migration. And then as we look at the review process, how can we look at that as a way of identifying and moving forward on some of these challenges we're facing today?
Yeah, thank you, Rula. You rightly pointed out that climate change being included in the GCM is quite novel and quite bold for any sort of global compact, some more than others, and I won't name the others. But I feel very privileged to be here to be a part of this panel, and that for climate change to give the same sort of standing as other drivers of migration. I think it's been pointed out by many speakers that the conversation about drivers is not new, but I think engagement with climate change as a major driver of migration is relatively new. And I think that is important, and it speaks to the point we're in today. And that is that one of the challenges actually is ensuring that climate change isn't just seen as kind of a tertiary issue, a niche issue. That those that live, work, and breathe on this issue, like myself, aren't the only ones that are interested in it or see it as a legitimate driver of migration in some cases. Now, huge caveat, climate change is never kind of the only driver of migration, but it plays a role certainly in exacerbating existing vulnerabilities and kind of the ability to overcome any sort of shocks to livelihoods, for instance. And I actually want to put this into context today. Because climate change is not some sort of future crisis. It's happening now, it's happening today. We see at this very moment, large parts of South Asia underwater, including over a third of Bangladesh. The number of named storms in the Atlantic hurricane season being higher than ever before and mounting. The wildfire season in California is occurring earlier than ever before, and it's more intense than ever before. We see locusts and massive flooding also in the Horn of Africa and East Africa that are wreaking havoc. So that is to say that climate change is, a factor in everyday people's lives today. And also there might be, limits to adaptation in place, adaptation in situ. So, objective 2 is very clear about talking about investment in climate change adaptation and resilience, disaster risk reduction. And I think that's important. It's always a first order of business to allow people to actually have as much agency as possible to make the choice to stay in their places of origin and not have to migrate if they don't have to. But I think what we're seeing and what climate scientists are telling us is that there may be limits to that sort of investment. And so I think this also necessarily means that objective 2 and its components cannot be kind of separated and siloed from other discussions, including about available, safe, and just pathways for decent work, for example, and those things outlined by objective 5 within the compact. And so that's kind of one set of challenges, I think, is really seeing climate change as something that's not a niche issue. The second challenge would be COVID-19, and other speakers have mentioned this before. COVID-19 has laid bare the persistent complexity and interconnection between climate change and migration issues, actually. So if we take the case of India, COVID-19 and subsequent lockdowns really hit migrant workers' livelihoods the hardest. Those that are working in the informal economy in cities in particular, who were left without any support, especially economic support and economic assistance, forcing them to walk thousands of miles back home, essentially, to their places of origin. In some cases, in particular in the Sundarbans, for instance, that meant that these migrants were put right in the path of Cyclone Amphan. And so I'm currently writing a report with RI that looks at these issues, and it finds that, these returned migrant workers are left in even more precarious situations than usual because of COVID-19. They don't have access to kind of economic lifelines as they once would. They aren't able to send back remittances to families to help them build back. And, they find that Cyclone Amphan, although, was not as destructive or didn't have such a high death toll, it did really do a number on croplands there. In both Bangladesh and India, actually, where some fields are salinized beyond repair for 3 to 5 years. So this is really kind of a long-term issue for those who are living on the edge. COVID-19 has also meant border closures, as everyone has mentioned, restrictions on mobility, and even kind of impact on much needed progress related to regional integration and freedom of movement. Freedom of movement is especially important post-disaster, and mechanisms like the Platform on Disaster Displacement have shown that it's really a successful way in which we can get regions to cooperate together to allow people to seek safety across borders post-disaster. So COVID-19 has implications for this sort of progress. It also affects kind of bottom lines and budgets, and it diverts attention away from climate change adaptation and resilience measures, even though we know that these measures are essential to ensure that people have the choice whether or not to migrate. And we also know that we must build back better or greener in the face of kind of a COVID-19 disaster. But this also leads to the next challenge, which is kind of coherence between migration and climate change policy, especially for the people who are being affected on the ground. So we use India as one example. But we also can reference Build Back Better again. If we ask who are we building back better for, and on the backs of whom, then we start thinking, or we start seeing that the intersections of climate change policy and migration policy are not so disconnected, right? For example, in the US, Building Back Better means often having migrant workers come in and aiding in the construction industry. And this is not just relegated to the US. I also worked a lot in Thailand, or did research in Thailand, and this is par for the course. The construction industry is largely supported by migrant workers, right? And so, these are some things, the ways in which climate change and migration issues intersect, and the ways in which we're not really talking about them. On the positive side, the GCM in particular and the reviews could help to bridge this gap. Can we interest those who might just be interested in migrants' rights or development and economics with more broad discussions about upstream climate change environment issues and policies. And that would be also, of course, up to civil society to push policymakers on this. And there's a lot of things that we can do, for instance. So I'm part of also the Climate Change, Migration, and Displacement platform. And we will be, for example, undertaking a scan of all ongoing initiatives. They may not be explicitly framed as contributions to GCM implementation, and to bring them into kind of the GCM review fold. And hopefully this can support ideas for how to create action, identify any sort of champions or stakeholders that are working on this, and show and tell how what they're doing is applicable. And get some concrete steps towards implementation. So that's just kind of a brief reflection, and I'll throw it back to you, to Rula, to moderate the rest of the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kylie. And I think you've really kind of explained the connections so well between climate change and migration, and how the two worlds also intersect, and how do we begin these kinds of conversations, which are, as you say, still very new. I would like to come back to you at some point, and I think maybe we can come back to the whole, climate change and gender kind of, sectoral lenses more and more, and explore these in depth.